Hello, everyone. Let's put away our digital devices and put our eyes up front. Welcome back to Great Decisions, one of our absolute very, very favorite things we do all year long. We've got a very special treat today. I think all of you know or have probably heard Tom Bartlett speak for us in the past. I'm going to, I'll do the official introduction of him in a little bit. But first I want to tell you about some upcoming things that we have. Like we did last week, we are streaming live, which probably doesn't matter for you. I mean, I suppose you could get really meta and watch it on your phones while you're in the room, but we're doing it for people who can't make the Great Decisions, and it's a wonderful way for folks at home to be able to also ask questions and connect Oregonians to the world beyond the face-to-face, which is a nice thing to do. So next week for Great Decisions, we have Dr. Barbara Tint, who is Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution here at PSU, who will be looking at issues around the U.S. and Israel. Always a fun topic. Also, we had to reschedule the energy independence talk. We can't do it in this room because it'll be after the class is over. But March 28th at noon, we will do John Kaufman giving his talk on energy independence at the Madison Room at the Oregon Historical Society. So check our website for details, but March 28th, it's a Friday, so it's kind of easy to remember. It's just a couple weeks after this is over. This evening, if you feel like venturing out to the Fur Acres Main Stage Theater at Lewis and Clark, we are hosting a really phenomenal event. Joanna Sherman, who is a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow and the artistic director of the Bond Street Theater in New York, is in town giving a talk and a presentation on the power of performance. She's spent 30 years doing theater with communities in conflict zones around the globe, places like the Balkans and Haiti and the Middle East, and she has been doing a very, very interesting project in Afghanistan with women. And it is participatory theater, but it is also educating them about their rights as voters and citizens. It's very, very bold, very exciting work. It is at 7 p.m. at Lewis and Clark College. It is a free event. She is a woman who is changing the world, as I keep teasing you about. Another woman changing the world we will have next Tuesday, February 25th at 12 p.m. in the Madison Room at the Oregon Historical Society, where our offices are. We will have Helen Nekruraya, who is a Maasai woman, talking about transforming the lives of Maasai girls. She is a very, very remarkable woman. She has spent a lifetime taking stands against things like child marriage, female genital mutilation, the rights of widows. She was first married off at the age of 9 in exchange for 3 cows, and she ran away and later was educated. She's founded this education complex in Kenya that is giving young girls and women not just schooling but vocational training, and she has founded a couple different widows' villages. Widows in Maasai culture have no rights, they have no rights for property, and she's a remarkable woman. So come and hear her story. Also coming up, another woman changing the world, Masha Gessen, a fantastic Russian journalist who has moved to this country recently. She's been writing a lot about gender issues in Russia for Slate, but she has written a book called Words Will Break Cement, which is about the punk rock band Pussy Riot. She will be speaking March 11th at 7:30 p.m. at Powell's. We are very excited to bring her into town. She's written previously a very well-received book on Vladimir Putin called Man Without a Face. And then he's not a woman changing the world, but he is a man with a lot to say. Senator Ron Wyden will be giving a talk March 18th at 7 p.m. at First Congregational Church. This is part of a year-long look at the legacy of Senator Wayne Morse. And we are looking at issues around war powers and governmental transparency. And he is talking about national security, civil liberties, and the surveillance state. It is a free talk, but registration is required. Details are on our website. And then finally, March 21st, the Pakistani author T.V. Paul will be in town talking on the warrior state, on Pakistan and the contemporary world. He is at McGill's in Montreal. He's an expert on security and South Asian affairs. That will also be in our space. Very, very sharp guy. And finally, I know you're all wondering about Women Changing the World, and you're wondering about the International Speakers Series, and you want me to tell you something, and I'm not going to, but I'm going to tell you, actually, I'm not going to do it. The world will tell you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. At 9 a.m., the information will go live on the Oregonian site. It'll be in the print edition if you're a subscriber to Old Growth Media. The Sunday edition will have an article, and you can find out everything you need to know about women changing the world tomorrow morning. And I guarantee you, you'll be very, very excited. Now on to today. Tom Bartlett, Dr. Thomas Bartlett, one of our very, very favorites. He has been a previous board chair of the World Affairs Council of Oregon. He has been the president of the American University in Cairo twice. I will give you a little bit of his official bio. He began his career as the advisor for political and security affairs for the U.S.'s permanent mission to the United Nations. This was during the days of giants who walked the earth like Henry Cabot Lodge and Adlai Stevenson. He served as president of the American University in Cairo, as president of Colgate University, and president of the Association of American Universities. He went on to become the chancellor of the state systems of higher education for Alabama, Oregon, and New York. He has served as a member and then chairman of the U.S.-Japan Foundation. He has since retired from all boards. Is this true? And was called back to Egypt at a certain point to be American University in Cairo president as an interim. He has received he received a BA in political science and international relations at Stanford University. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned his MA, and then he went back to Stanford to earn his PhD in political science. He's smarter than a whip, very, very funny, very engaged, and we were always happy to have him. So big hand for Tom Bartlett.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now, the first thing we have to do is take care of the mechanics. Can you hear me? Yes. That's a relief, because my voice is getting old at the same rate I am. And so sometimes I can be heard and sometimes I can't. I'm going to proceed in a rather atypical way. I hope it's atypical, because I am going to argue with my topic. The topic: Islamic awakening. What does that mean? In a literal sense, I don't know what I'm talking about. I never was aware that Islam was asleep. And which Islam are we talking about? There are 1.6 billion people Muslims in the world. 62% of them are in the Asia-Pacific region. They are not where we read about events on the front pages of the paper. Which Islam am I to talk about? And where is Islam awakening? Now, in order to get at a topic, therefore, under this heading, I'm going to do what John Entellus did in his article. I'm going to invent a topic. So let's see if we can narrow down on something useful, potentially, to talk about. Which countries? Well, if you read the newspapers, we're talking about countries that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. And that's a crucial fact. But not the whole Ottoman Empire can be talked about, because that includes Iran. It's quite different from the Arab world in its circumstances. Turkey, related but quite different. The Balkans. So it isn't the whole old Ottoman Empire, it's just a piece. I guess it's the Arabic-speaking piece of the old Ottoman Empire. Well, but the circumstances in the Gulf countries are very different from the Arabic-speaking parts of the old empire that aren't in the Gulf. Therefore, let's make our topic the non-Gulf Arabic-speaking countries formed from the old Ottoman Empire. That isn't Arab awakening, but that's at least a topic to begin with. In those countries that we've now narrowed down to, there's a revolution going on. And maybe what we should focus on is the role of Islam, or the circumstances of Islam, within that revolution. And I'm going to give you a hint of where I'm going to come out, because I think that religion is a category and a form of expression that being employed in a much larger revolutionary context, a revolution which is not a revolution of religion. There may be a civil war within religion, but that's a different issue that we will touch upon. And I want to begin, again, trying to figure out how to attack the subject with the issue of increasing religiosity. I'm not using religiosity in any sense as a pejorative term. I mean by religiosity, the outward and visible expressions of religion. The public part of religion I'm going to call religiosity. Well, that kind of religiosity began a long time before 2011. And Tellus in his article gives us a good way of following the development of that religiosity. When the region that we're talking about, which is really the Maghreb and the eastern Mediterranean coast, essentially, and they became independent at the end of the Second World War, the first regimes were pretty consistently secular, statist, authoritarian, military in their essential core of organization. They were an attempt to bring in modernity, whatever in the world that meant, at a rapid rate by being all the things I've described: secular, statist, semi-social, socialist. It's hard to realize, but when we first got to the American University, now 51 years ago, for heaven's sake, it was not uncommon to see co-eds at the American University right downtown on Meydan Tahrir, Liberation Square, in miniskirts. For a young woman, co-ed or not, to be wearing a scarf on the street would be thought very odd indeed. And full-length black clothing for women on the street would have been virtually unknown. You had to get into rural, rather primitive, agricultural, traditional villages to see women completely in black. And usually they were old and overweight. Never mind. After the '67 war, and I'm giving something that was vague, a date, but after the '67 war, which was a tragedy from the point of view of the countries in this area, the secular, modernist, statist governments began to sense that they were losing part of their publics. And so what happened? They began to demonstrate religiosity themselves, the leaders of these countries. A good example, of course, the one that I know the best, was Anwar Sadat. Very religious, very Muslim, very military, and very authoritarian. All at the same time. These were not contradictory. He was succeeded by President Mubarak. All the same things could be said about Mubarak. They and their wives did not practice clothing religiosity, but they were very clearly employing Islamic signs and signals and seeing themselves very much in an Islamic tradition. It was a way of reconnecting with people, particularly in the lower classes, the middle classes, for whom religion and religiosity was something that they could get a hold of. And for reasons that I'm going to describe in a moment, they needed to get a hold of something because modernity was not doing the job. In fact, the secular world for a lot of these people, and I mean secular in the sense of non-traditional religious world, was very threatening and a great deal of insecurity. As another factor, which I'm going to bring in a moment, played its way out, survival for an awful lot of people became very uncertain. These were people who had grown up in the tradition of an agricultural society where you could always subsist by growing your own food. Well, that world was going away. But the categories of religion and central government, being the objects of central government, were familiar categories. And those continued to persist and to be understood by the leadership of the country to be categories in which to communicate. The real problem was not religious. It wasn't even, in one sense, governmental. It was that a population explosion was going on, unprecedented in human history, still going on, but never mind. That population explosion meant that resources of land and water were beyond the needs of the people. And how are we going to adjust ourselves to this insecurity and threat? Which brings me to the real revolution, which is not a religious revolution. The real revolution is not an event or a series of events that you're reading about on the front pages of the newspapers or listening to in the nightly news. Those are not very useful categories in which to understand what's going on. Some people talk about the revolution of 2011 as if it were over in 2 months. Well, it has only barely begun. The revolution of 2011 in the public squares in Egypt, in Tunisia, smaller extent on across the Maghreb, these were really forms of declarations of independence. But the Declaration of Independence was a declaration of independence from the past. This was a point at which populations were aroused because they wanted to go on to something that was different. And it wasn't just political, it wasn't just economic, it depended on the class as to which it was. But one way or another, by golly, we want to go on to something different. Well, it isn't possible for a society to simply decide, okay, we're now going to be different. We're going to think differently, we're going to have different institutions we're going to put in place tomorrow, revolution done. Next issue. Those kinds of changes which require a redefinition of society, a creation of institutions that do not exist, that are something different from the past, those kinds of changes take decades, generations, and we are in the early stages of that kind of trial and error evolution that will go on for a long time, and it will involve going forward and backward and to the side and to the back and all over the place, because people have to, essentially by trial and error, create something new. Now, in the case of the political side, we're talking about areas that have no real political parties. They don't know that political parties exist in order to create coalitions of people who don't necessarily agree completely in order to form majorities. Because if you're going to have a government that has some identification with the population, you've got to have a political parties or some political structure that will create governing majorities. You also have to have reassurance for the people who are not in the majority, that is to say the minorities, that they're going to be protected at some elemental level because their turn is coming. It isn't now, but they have to accept the majority in some level of acceptance. None of this tradition in any form exists in any of the areas I'm talking about. These populations are experimenting at the earliest stages in how to be an independent nation state. I use both those words, nations and states. We may have states, we don't yet have nations, if in the Westphalian sense. I've talked about politics in one sense, but let's think about societies in another way. Societies need units, publicly or unconsciously, that decentralize and distribute power and decision-making. Highfalutin words. Let me suggest what I mean. In a modern state, you've got to have things like educational institutions that worry about education. You need NGOs of all sorts, from the Rotary Club to I don't know what. You need political subdivisions. You can call them all kinds of states, provinces, counties, governorates, but some kinds of subdivisions that people can get at. And when you put all of these different kinds of units in place in a society, what you've ended up with doing is decentralizing power and control. And that's why, if you look at authoritarian states, they work like crazy to prevent these kinds of groupings that are seemingly informal and rather innocent from coming into existence. The person who really was the master at preventing anything like that was, of course, Gaddafi. He didn't even allow the military to become an institution, let alone any of these other forms of social subdivision that, because they operate, end up cumulatively exercising real power. And an economic system has to come into place. Well, what does an economic system ultimately consist of? Well, at its most 39,000-foot level, a system of production and a system of distribution. Seems pretty elegant, doesn't it? Not easy to do. We in the United States have always struggled with the issue, and we certainly are now. But in states that are still in the process of becoming nations, as well as states, trying to figure out an economic system that is both productive and distributive ain't that easy. The reason we had to take out the Gulf states from all of this is because they have a completely different set of challenges in trying to figure out how you create an economy that is both productive and distributive. But that we're not talking about them, so I don't have to explain. Now, all of this nation forming, again, I'm going to go back to another theme earlier, is taking place in the context of an unprecedented demographic explosion. I find myself always going back to the issue of population. And population in that part of the world, because it ain't like nothing else that human beings have ever been through. And it has implications that are profound in all directions and often ignored. Let me just give you a couple of numbers here that illustrate the point. 37% of the population are 15 or under. 40% of the population are 16 or under. Think of how many young males, also females, are coming to the age or in the age when they expect to form families within a cultural set of assumptions about what a family is, how it operates, and how you form it, and not being able to go through that process because they don't have jobs, they don't have sources of, they can't rent or buy an apartment. They can't present to the bride's family the prospect that the man can keep the family supported. Just think how all those people on the street with rising aspirations and falling possibilities. Demography. Along with it, poverty. Overstressed land and water. Class rigidities. A set of numbers that I use, always keep in my own mind, just for the heck of it, in the case of Egypt, because that's the place I know best, is the 40 times 4 formula. Now, there's an enigma. The 40 plus times 4 is the following. In the case of Egypt, they have to import 40% of their food. 40%. They're the largest wheat importers in the world, never mind Asia. 40% of the population is illiterate. Not a promising beginning when you're trying to create a participatory society. 40% of the population live at or below the poverty level. And boy, I mean poverty level. And then, of course, 40% of the population are 16 and under. Now, that gives you some kind of background. These numbers will vary with the country, but all of the issues that these numbers suggest in one form or another, except in some cases the food import, apply. All right. Now, I've artfully avoided talking about religion. I can't get out of it, so I will hit it head on. In the circumstances that I'm describing, religion has two functions. One, it's a way to live with these kinds of frustrating issues. We fall back on our faith, to put it in a more American contemporary phraseology. And the categories of religion are a means of expressing the problems. We can talk with each other in religious language and expression. Egypt right now, I'm going back and forth. I was in Cairo 3 weeks ago, and I was there in October, and I will be back in June, as well as Kuwait. Religion per se is not a central issue, nor are liberal values. Now, why do I say that? Everybody's religious. The support for the military to get rid of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood was in no sense a rejection of religion. It certainly didn't mark a sudden decline in religiosity, au contraire. The military embrace religion. They embrace religiosity. The rejection of the Muslim Brotherhood was not a rejection of Islam in any sense, since everybody involved professes Islam, religion, except the Christians, and they profess Christianity. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a party, so this was not a rejection of a political party. The Muslim Brotherhood is something else. It's a society that seeks power to change society. It has membership. It has religious traditions. It doesn't function as a political party. It doesn't know anything about governance. And one of the things that Morsi's period demonstrated was the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't know about governance, isn't concerned about governance. I mean by that keeping the streets clean, security, keeping the economy running, all these pedestrian little nothings that actually shape our lives. They were concerned with gaining power to change society in a way that they thought it ought to change. And that indeed was dealt with an expression of religion. But they weren't trying to express that religion against people who wanted non-religion. This was not a battle, is not a battle between religion and non-religion. Everybody's religious. The revolution is about something else. As far as liberal political values are concerned, well, we've never experienced them. We've heard about them. We hear other folks who are rather interesting in other parts of the world talk about them. They're rather attractive. We like the idea. But right now, we've got other things we've got to put at first priority. Now, what is that? That is I have 3 pieces of paper, so naturally I am always on the wrong one. The priority at the moment is very clear. It's palpable. You can feel it. It is security, order, predictability, economic survival, normality in daily life as people have experienced that normality. Until we can have these kinds of, serve these kinds of issues, we can't worry about liberal, secular, political values very much. In our political theory classes, when we're all in college, we all get familiar with Thomas Hobbes. Well, Hobbes has a little lesson for us in this context, because one of the things that Hobbes made very clear was that life in a state of nature is a disaster, and people will inevitably come together in ways to get order, predictability, security. Then they'll worry about other values in their public life. Well, that's kind of where we are now. in much of the area I'm talking about. The Tunisians are attacking the problem in one way, the Egyptians in another way. Good night. The Libyans in a very different way, and so are the Syrians. But they're all tackling this basic challenge that before you do anything else, you've got to have these Hobbesian initial formations to get out of a state of nature, which is the way Hobbes described a situation in which you do not have functioning institutions of order. The support for the military is not because people are fed up with religion. Religion, as I say, is taken for granted. The support for the military is because they are the one institution that is fully developed and exists in most of the areas, and they are the one institution, therefore, that might be able to produce some kind of everyday predictability and normality. And it is very important for us to understand that we're dealing with societies in revolution in the sense that I'm using the word revolution, not about changes of political changes of government at the moment, but fundamental redefinition and reestablishment of society and the institutions that that society requires. This is not a battle between Islam and non-Islam. And Arab awakening as a topic suggests, A, that Islam has been asleep, which it hasn't been. It's a rather rapidly growing religion, in fact. That the issue in the revolutions that are going on are religious. They're not. Religion is simply one of the categories in which these revolutions are being acted out and expressed. And one of the advantages of religion as a category, incidentally, is that everybody is involved. One of the things that's been fascinating is to see in these societies, that people don't know each other. They have been so separated by class and all the implications of class that each group thinks, oh yeah, I know what it means to be in my case, it's Egyptian. Isn't everybody like me? Sure, we're all Egyptians, and here's the way we are. Well, suddenly people are discovering, well, that isn't true. I didn't know anything about those Salafis. Where did they come from? Oh, you mean we've got all those people who can't read and write? Well, I kind of know about them because I drive through the villages when I'm on my way to Alexandria. But I don't know anything about them I'm discovering, or what they think about, or what their problems are. There's a lot of things that I don't know about my own country. We're going to see more and more self-discovery going on as people emerge from controlled, top-down government where the kinds of decentralizing institutions I was referring to a moment ago do not exist and have not existed. I know that's hard for us to imagine, and it's hard for me to express, but it is really interesting to sense it going on. Speaking of sensing it going on, I do want to mention one thing that I think I didn't say enough. The last two visits, one of the things that has impressed me, I mentioned it earlier, I want to reinforce it, is the desperate intentionality of getting on with our lives. You can almost feel it. By golly, I am going to go. I'm going to go where I need to go. I'm going to do what I need to do in the senses of my personal necessities, and I don't care about what anybody else is going to do. I'm going to live normally. It's really fascinating to feel that. It still takes 2 hours to get from the airport to downtown Cairo. The traffic is that heavy. Most people are walking around doing what they need to do. All right, now I want to put one really troubling new element into this picture. One of the things that is new is the phenomenon of random terrorism. These cultures are not used to that. The culture that is the least used to that in the region is Egypt. This is unknown, and the whole social fabric rebels against it. But the thing about individual acts of terrorism, random almost acts of terrorism, is it doesn't take very many people, and it isn't clear how you defend yourself. Now, one of the interesting challenges is going to be for this increasingly repressive military regime that's now taking over to see how effective they are with all the exercise of power and control that they're putting into place in preventing random acts of violence. Now, why are these random acts of violence occurring? Well, a lot of it is because you have had individuals go off to fight in Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen, and they're coming home. They're Egyptians coming home. And they have developed a whole nother mini culture, which is brand new. And it isn't clear how the society can deal with that in this drive for order, predictability, normality, and so on. And of course, one of the incidental impacts of those random acts is to scare the wits out of people in other countries about going to Egypt or anywhere in the area as tourists. When I was there last month, I wandering around, I was thinking, this place was created for tourists. The climate, the controlled exoticism, the facilities that have been put in place, the endless supply of cheap labor, the linguistic capacities. Boy, are those folks good at learning languages. All of these things that are just perfect for tourism, and that it'd be hard to think of an industry that is easier to stop with random acts of violence. Because the first people to get scared are foreigners who don't know where they're going, what they're getting into. I would add, there have been no violence in Luxor or Aswan that involved anything like the tourist industry. If you go to the pyramids, you own the place. You have all kinds of people to take you around. You can spend as long as you like. You can go to Dashur and all the other pharaonic antiquities. The battles aren't being fought there. The disturbances are happening. It's a wonderful time to be a tourist. Not a chance in the world that people are going to take advantage of that. Now, to go back to something vaguely related to the theme that I think I was probably supposed to draw from the title, though that's not clear. Religion is one of the terms in which the struggles are being expressed, and there is indeed a kind of civil war among Muslims about how they ought to express their faith. That's not the real, those aren't the real struggles. And from my point of view, I would conclude this part by saying, I think it's very unfortunate that those are the terms, symbols, traditions within which part of the struggle is taking place. I think it's a dead-end form of the struggle, but it's not surprising since Islam is ubiquitous and believers are everywhere. I'm going to quit now because I wandered all over the place trying to find a topic, and I would like you to pin me down. I'm a slippery fellow, but you can get me to come to ground here. And incidentally, I am comforted by the fact that I have no sense that John Entellus had any more idea what the topic is than I do, because he wrote some great paragraphs. I learned a lot from his paragraphs. I never could figure out what his topic was.
So we will take questions. I do want to remind you that because we don't always have a lot of time, to keep what you say into this mic a question, not have it be a statement or a manifesto or a diatribe or a missive, but ask a good question. He's a smart fellow. I'm going to ask you a question, I think, to start things off. You talked about the awakening not being religious, but yep. I'm wondering if you can talk about three somewhat disparate events that all happened at the same year. In 1979, there were three things that happened. One was the Iranian Revolution. The other was the Camp David Accords. And the other was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, all of which I think had some spiral effect in terms of radicalization or a new political reality for Islamic culture. Can you talk about that at all?
I guess I'm dealing with cause and effect. Religion is a category in which a lot is being expressed. And it is a category that brings together classes in their different views. But I would suggest that these conflicts would not be taking place if we weren't talking about societies in revolutionary circumstances. It's the difference between cause and form of expression. It isn't religion that's causing the revolutions. These are, take the case of Iran. Although Iran is a bad case because Iran has been so much the victim of the United States policy that it is hard to think, to explain and analyze Iran in its own context. I mean, do we remember a guy named Mossadegh? The first democratically, honestly elected ruler of Iran forever? Overthrown explicitly, publicly, no question about the fact, by a CIA revolution, and replaced by a guy called Shah Reza Pahlavi. Now, if you were an Iranian, how would you feel about that? And if you were an Iranian and you heard the President of the United States talk about the axis of evil, followed by an invasion of your next door neighbor, as we got rid of the axis of evil, and you were the second one mentioned, how would you feel? And what would you be thinking? The Iranians are another topic, but I am very uncomfortable, practically un-American, in the way I think about the history of the United States and Iran since the days of the Cold War. I am hopeful in the sense that the younger generation in Iran, in spite of everything, is going to produce its own revolution, which will move the country beyond the beginning revolution that started with the end of the Shah, but which is only a beginning. That society has still got a lot of revolution to work through. Now, am I talking about your topic at all?
You're kind of in the neighborhood. Well, if you don't want to talk about Iran, what about talking about the assassination of Sadat as an example?
The assassination of Sadat was a direct result of the treaty peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Now, it was carried out by people in the name of religion because there was an assumption that that peace treaty was, in a sense, an undermining of Islam. But the person who shot him, what he was fundamentally mad about was the peace treaty. Now, is that religious? I don't know. It certainly has a religious aspect, but the thing that was driving it was a sense that Sadat had sold out the Arabs signing the peace treaty. And he'd sold out to the Americans and to the international community and needed to get shot. Now, that wasn't necessarily the view of most Egyptians, although a lot of them did have that feeling. But it was enough to tick off the extremists to think the only way to deal with this guy is shoot him. Yes, please.
You indicated earlier about the... I'm sorry. You indicated earlier that the high birth rate, the number of people in the younger ages and so on. Could you tie that into family practice where women are considered chattel, and where that arose from, if not religion? Where did that culture come from?
Well, just on that last point, you can find lots of cultures that treat women like chattel who have never heard of Islam. But that's a different... let me go at your question because it's a very important subject. What I didn't say was that birth rates have gone down dramatically. The reason they've gone down has nothing to do with religion, and the reason they were so high before had very little to do with religion. These are cultural phenomena, and I'll explain what I mean by that. If you're in an agricultural society, which Egypt was until the Second World War, very productive agricultural society, kids are hands. The more kids you have in the family, the more hands you've got to work with the land. Moreover, if you're in a rather primitive technological society, there is a very high infant mortality rate. So you've got to have a lot of children born in order to get all those hands, because half of them are going to die. What you do then, in that frame of mind, is you produce a culture that says, boy, produce children. Then some things happen. One, civil engineering and vaccinations, and infant mortality starts going down like that. Two, you run out of land, and so hands are no longer an advantage. In fact, children are a net cost and a burden, and families that want to do a good job for their children can't because they cost too much. It is not a religious issue. What has happened is a tremendous fall in birth rate, from maybe 5 or 6 per woman to something like 2 plus 3 or 4, for reasons that are essentially sociological, economic, psychological. There is no ban in Islam to control birth. Abortion is something else, but birth control, the head of Azhar will tell you that that's okay. The problem is that civil engineering, vaccinations, former high birth rates have created a population distribution by age, even in the face of falling birth rates, leaves in place what they call demographic inertia, which is all of these young people, if they all had one child, there would be population growth because there are so many families that are going to be formed. Now, 30 years from now, that's going to turn around. The best judgments I've heard from people who think they know, which is always a curious thing, and I begin with myself, is that the population in Egypt, with luck, will level off at 120 million. It's standing room only. Only 5% of the country is habitable. But that's not ultimately a religious issue. Religion is a framework in which it has to be expressed, and you have to deal with the religious aspects of how you control birth, and you certainly can't involve abortion and so on. All kinds of religious issues involved, but it isn't driven by religion.
Usually, considering Islamic Africa, we focus on the north, the Maghreb from Morocco to Egypt. But in Africa, the two largest population countries are Nigeria and Ethiopia. And in each one, the population is about 50-50,
right.
Muslim, Christian, or animist. And the terrorism factor, it seems like it's settled down in Ethiopia, and it was never a Christian-Muslim confrontation as much. But in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, with this Boko Haram group that's been killing hundreds of Christians, I wonder if this will set up a civil conflict, because the growth rate of both countries is still way too high.
I used to know something about Nigeria way back when I was working at the UN. I know very little. I've been in the old days to various parts of it. It is a very sharply divided country, or at least it always has been. And what you were saying about it makes sense. I don't have any idea where this is going. I can't help. I can't say anything useful. Nigeria also has an exploding population, however, and there's no question that creates, again, a kind of drive, because the people you have to worry about are young single men. I think that's a generalization, and I'm a father of what were once 3 young men. They're now old.
Do you have any advice for American policy in the region? And I would particularly like, apart from what you've discussed already, there are 2 themes that seem to be playing out that we should disengage more than we are. One is the fracking revolution, which is making us oil and gas independent, and we don't need to be so involved in the Middle East. And the other is the pivot to Asia, where we see the future is more in Asia than it, and we need to get out of our entanglements in the Middle East. Thank you.
And again, if you're talking about Islam, as I said at the outset, most Muslims are in the Asia Pacific. They're not in the Middle East. That you would not know that reading the press, but that's really, I think it's 62% I was suggesting. Well, let me put it in as blunt and categorical terms as I can, my own view. And that's all it is, obviously. The United States cannot control what's happening in the Arab Middle East. We've tried. There are a lot of people who would like to. And if you like Iraq, it's a great policy. But we cannot control what is going to happen in that region. Now, can we exercise influence? Absolutely. I can remember when the United States was the most popular and influential country in the world in the Middle East. As your author and Tellus points out, that sure ain't the case now. Why is that? It is because we have tried to emphasize hard power where we're not going to be effective. All we do is create enemies, because that hard power is going to be matched by counter power in some form, which means we're creating a lot of enemies. What worked before and will work now is soft power. And by soft power, I mean treating the states in the area as they struggle to become nations, treating them in a way that I would call normal. We need to look for investment opportunities. If they were good, we go in. We need to be ready to help in case of emergencies, when there are particular issues where we can be helpful, but not be seen as being trying to take over. We need to have lots of student exchanges, which are very popular in that part of the world. We need to emphasize by our actions and our words our faith in liberal values. We need to do all the things that most of us would think are normal international relations on our part. But if we think that our policy interests, whatever they are, and I can think of a few, but I won't talk about that, are going to be advanced by our trying to control or to dominate or to set limits, quote unquote, forget it. Because it isn't going to work. All it's going to do is to continue to develop counter force from the people in the area. Because what we have done is to create people who are convinced that they should be against us, as well as people who think they should be for us. And at that point, good luck. And remember, this is a small and relatively economically backward part of the world. And I say that as a person who invested much of my life in it.
Moving into the unpredictable, what do you see Egypt to be in 10 or 20 years?
In the area?
Yeah. You have the big,
I don't think we have a clue.
440s and so many problems. What do you
I
see
don't
for
think
the
we
future?
know. I can describe problems in Egypt for which there is no solution that I can imagine, and that simply lead to catastrophe. Not hard at all. I can put together a future with all kinds of optimistic developments and assumptions that doesn't lead to disaster. That's harder. But the reality of it is we just don't have a clue. For example, how fast are we going to develop in the world? When I say we, I mean the world. Technology to capture solar radiation and move it around and do it in a competitive economic framework. Well, Egypt is the most richly endowed country in the world in terms of solar radiation. Look at Algeria, or Tunisia for that matter, though it's relatively small. Endless quantities of solar radiation ready to be harvested if we have the technology to do it. And once you can do that with Europe sitting there needing that energy, bingo, problem solved. Is that going to happen? The Gulf countries for the next 30 years decide that it's so much in their interest that the other parts of the Arab world, the non-oil parts, or at least some of the non-oil parts, are so important that they're going to go in there and invest and take advantage of all that cheap energy, labor, endless quantities of cheap labor, put them to work, create a kind of an echo of the Chinese model where you use cheap labor to produce cheap goods, putting a lot of people to work. Lots of people are available to work, bingo. 20 years from now, you've got a settled, productive industrial economy based on cheap labor. In an age of electronic technology exploding, is that possible? I don't think anybody has a very good view of what the area is going to be 20 years from now. And my guess is however it's going to be, it will be different each country, each state, because each one has a different history and trajectory. It's interesting to remember that Tunisia had a constitution in the 1860s. That's hard to believe, isn't it? And they had, if you will remember, a guy named Bourguiba, when they came to independence from the French again after the Second World War. Very sophisticated, enlightened, top-down leadership, but very much moving the country forward. They're totally different trajectory than Libya right next door. I don't, what's going to happen to Libya is going to be very different from what's going to happen to Tunisia, and neither of them is going to be like Morocco. Having said that, they're all going to be different, I would then finish by saying, and I don't have a clue what 20 years from now, how those differences will have been expressed. Well, I think I have oh yes, I'm way over time. I apologize for that. I get started. Thank you.